What's up guys, welcome back to another game recap. Been a while since I've recorded one of these it feels like, but we're still catching up on a bunch of them. But nonetheless, here is round 5 from the Ryde Eastwood Open, where I had won my last game. I was on 4 out of 4 points. And for this game, I was paired against International Master Igor Bjelobrk. But nonetheless, I've played him once before in my life. This is when I was, I think, probably 14 years old. This is all the way back in 2017. At the time of that game, I was rated around 2000 FIDE. I did end up losing the game, but it was like a long fight. So, yeah, anyways, that's just some background for the game. And Igor, I don't know, he's like in his late 30s, maybe early 40s. He's not super active these days, but he's a pretty solid player with both white and black. So I opened with one d4, and we have the following moves where I play knight f3. In the past, I played g3 a lot, angling for the Catalan in this fashion, but these days I sort of prefer knight f3, this move order a little bit more, because the g3 move order, it does allow c5, and I'm not a big fan of the fianchetto Benoni, and for a long time I tried to make these lines with knight f3 work, and they're not terrible, but after takes, a lot of the time, like online, for example, people just play knight c6, and if they just sort of play like in this sort of very passive setup like this, you can get like a pretty nice advantage. But the problem is that when they, know what they're doing and they just play very confrontationally in the center with d5, bishop g2, e5, they tend to get an equal position, and I've never been a really huge fan of all this stuff, which is why, and there's even other lines I think like in this position, by the way, like queen c7, which is also sort of playable. So yeah, I have a tough time really justifying playing this move order when there's a trade-off, right, where it's like when you play g3, b6 is not really a big deal because you just go bishop g2, and black sort of has to play something awkward like d5, and they don't really want to have to combine both of these moves. So okay, when you play the g3 move order, right, here in this position, you do sort of stop black from playing, if they're a Queen's Indian player, from playing this opening, right? But by playing the knight f3 move order, now c5 is not as big of a deal, because after d5 you can get a Benoni line that does not involve fianchetto. Generally, it's considered one of the more, maybe not harmless, but definitely one of the less critical ways to play against that opening. And while the Queen's Indian is definitely kind of solid, theoretically it doesn't feel quite as difficult to deal with as like this g3 c5 thing. But nonetheless, I play knight f3, and Igor, he plays d5. Against knight c3, I don't know exactly what he plays, but he probably plays something solid, right? So anyways, I stick to my guns, I play the Catalan, and we have bishop b4 check, which was kind of what I was expecting. This was also the afternoon game, so I had a little bit, not too much time to sort of look at stuff before that game, because keep in mind, with my last game, I won that pretty quickly, so I had a feeling I was going to play Igor, and so I had a bit of time to really check before the game and come up with something that would maybe be effective against this whole line. So anyways, we had the following moves where this is all sort of very standard theoretical stuff. And by the way, this is something which a lot of people don't quite understand. A lot of people ask me like, Sam, what's the purpose of bishop b4 check? And then going back to e7, it's like, didn't we just give white a free tempi in development? But the whole idea is if we compare to, like, say, bishop e7 in this position, and like all the following moves, right? Let's say they go knight b7, right? Queen c2, c6 maybe. Very often what white will do is they'll play knight bd2, black will play b6, e4, and this is a sort of desirable break. This is sort of why is revolving a lot of their play in the Catalan, in particular the closed Catalan, around. But when you go bishop b4 check and you provoke white into playing bishop d2, you go back, and now we have all these same moves. Well, now if you play queen c2, c6, well, you can't easily play knight b2, e4. And you might sort of be asking, like, well, why can't I play knight c3 instead of that? And, well, this is a more active place for my knight to be anyway. I'm going to play e4 next. What are you going to do? But the answer is actually black can just play like d takes e4. And white's compensation for the pawn is not actually super clear. E4, b5 is always going to be a theme. And generally speaking, I think black is actually just sort of better in these positions. Bishop b7, maybe a6, c5 is going to come at some point. White can maybe play e5 and like knight e4 or something, but in this exact position, I'm not super convinced by the compensation. Which is why sometimes people play something like b3 first and then try to go for knight c3. But still, there's the issue, like in these positions, like, okay, if bishop b7, e4, I think white's quite comfortable, but a very common move that black will play in these sort of setups and one that I've definitely played a lot from my experience of playing this bishop b4 check line, is instead of putting the bishop on b7, you put it on a6 instead, put pressure on the focal c4 pawn, such that now if e4, you're not going to take on e4, you're going to take on c4 instead. And these positions are complicated, right? It's not like black is just up a pawn and like they're just better, because white can, you know, be tricky and leave the pawn on c4 for a while. You can play a move like rook e1, and if black ever takes, you do get the open a file for the rook, and you do get some compensation to speak of. But anyways, there's a lot of theory that can be discussed in these lines after like queen c2, c6. You can go like, sorry, I'm clicking around all over the place here. You can go, for example, like bishop f4 in this position. You can go rook d1. You can, I mean, those are the main options, but there are sort of sub variations within each of those. But instead in the game, I had prepared something a little bit different. I had played bishop c3, and I was also prepared to play the same move, say like if they went, instead of putting the knight on d7 so quickly, if c6, I was also prepared to play bishop c3. But the move order where black has not yet committed the c pawn does offer this extra interesting option, let's say, where they can put a pawn on b6 and defeat their bishop without the c pawn sort of blocking it, right? Sorry for the terrible arrow. But sort of to illustrate one of white's ideas behind playing bishop c3, which is basically like, say, I don't know, c6, we're going to go knight b2. If black does go for a close-up with b6, we're going to go b4. And we're just sort of going to try and gain a lot of space on the queen side. And maybe even later at some point try to get in like the e4 break with something like queen c2, e4. But to be honest, from what I've seen, that's not super common in the setup. I think like queen b3, maybe bring the rook to c1, go a4, and just sort of try and play in the queen side. And I guess a critical sort of setup for black in this sort of bishop c3 line is to, like, say after c6, maybe like say instead of the knight being on d7, one of the critical lines, let's say, is for them to play d takes c4. And there's like some really weird concrete lines that can go pretty deep, like in these positions after some moves like this, right, where you go 95, and there's some stuff like this. And to be honest, I wasn't like super confident in all these details. I didn't remember them so well, but I was like, okay, at least I looked at this before the game. Igor probably hasn't, and so it made sense in the game that he played b6, a move which does not require, you know, like a lot of theoretical knowledge. You just sort of, you know, play chess, you play bishop b7, maybe go for a quick c5, and maybe you're going to take on a hanging pawn structure at some point with white taking on d5, and etc, etc. But okay, I played c takes d5. Pretty typical idea whenever black plays, you know, b6 in these structures, because generally speaking, like this sort of pawn structure is favorable for white. But there is sort of something playing into black's hands here, that we do have this sort of weird bishop on c3. This position would be a little bit better for white if they had the bishop still on this diagonal, so it could quickly go to a square like f4. You could play knight c3 next, rook c1, and just sort of continue with normal development. And for a while, the sort of main way to play this position was just to play like knight b2, the quickest way to develop the knight, and like, you know, you develop your pieces, maybe rook c1, queen c2, something like that, rook fd1. But an interesting idea in this position actually is to, again, utilize the fact that you actually would rather have the bishop on this diagonal and waste another move with bishop d2, but argue that because this structure is kind of subpar for black in the first place, that we don't actually mind wasting all this time with our pieces to get stuff into their sort of optimal positioning. So this is what I played, despite, you know, looking very strange, because I played bishop d2, bishop c3, and now I'm coming back to d2. But nonetheless, this is what I did. It's a kind of advanced idea, but okay, I had looked at this before the game and knew this was a thing, so I played the following moves, and we get to this position where after knight f6, I play e3. And this is an important concept for going into this whole bishop d2 thing, right? Was that I knew that I was going to get hit with some sort of like knight f8, knight e6 thing, and I probably do not want to have my pawn structure ruined like that. Even playing g takes f4, it's not a huge deal, I think. But I was more interested in playing this move e3, which looks a little bit maybe even risky, because we're borderline going to trap our bishop on f4. But basically, the strategic idea is that if black ever plays knight takes f4, I'm going to play e takes f4. And then I'm going to use the e file maybe to put my rook on, plant a knight in e5. Maybe I'm even going to transfer my bishop over to this diagonal, tough to say. But yeah, like knight e5, rook fe1, queen d3. I think that white has pretty good piece play in this position, which is why in the game, Igor did not go for the bishop here, and he instead just played a bit of a waiting move, bishop f8, which from a practical perspective I kind of like, because there is a certain amount of discomfort that white's going to feel with having their bishop on f4, where it can't really move. It has very limited mobility. For example, if black could get in something like h6 g5, and maybe like if after bishop b5 quickly go knight d7 f6, that could potentially be quite annoying for white to face. But of course, as you will have noticed, that will take quite a few moves to really accomplish. So I wasn't too worried. I just played rook e1, fitting into the whole concept of if they play knight takes f4, I'm just going to take and my rook will be on the open file. If they exchange, I don't think it's a huge deal. Do I have a big advantage? Probably not, but it's a little bit something to play with again. So in the game though, we had c5. Igor basically says enough waiting, I'm going to start going for what I want, which is maybe something saying like, you know, if I'm careless and play knight e5, he's going to play knight takes f4, and this is really not a structure that I want. With these sort of doubled, you know, isolated f pawns, this is a strategic nightmare, I think, from the white perspective. But yeah, after c5, this is where I took my sort of first real think of the game, because it's really not so easy to come up with a move. There is, again, like the sort of positional threat of like, you know, taking and then like taking on f4. At the moment, I can play knight takes d4, so it's not like a huge deal. For example, like, I don't know if, let's say, let's play a3. This does weaken some of the light squares maybe, but okay, also say like this happens. Something like this, I don't think I would be extremely bothered by, because I do have this isolated queen's pawn which I'm playing against, which feels like it does offer white some sort of, maybe not advantage, black still might be doing okay, but at least something like clear to play against, right? But okay, I realized like even if I did play a waiting move like that, black can also play like something like maybe h6, right? So I felt like this was the moment where, given my opponent's last move c5, he actually was somewhat inviting me to put some pressure on his position, because, you know, obviously c5 creates some tension between the d and c pawns, which does give that option to white in some positions to play a move like d takes c5, and now I'm sort of eyeing the d5 pawn. And this factor became very relevant, like in this position, maybe so what, right? Like, you just take back and it's not so clear what I've achieved. I've even lost control like over the e5 square quite a bit, so I probably don't want to go for that quite in this position, but it sort of came into relevance when I played my next move, bishop e5, which I might have spent like around 20 or so minutes calculating. And keep in mind, this is like a 60 plus 40 game, so it's quite a bit of time. But basically, on a fundamental level, my idea is like, I just want to take, and he doesn't really want to take back the g pawn, so probably he's going to take back the queen, but then I'm going to plant my knight on e5, and I'm just going to put pressure on the d5 pawn. And if the pawn was still back on c7, it could come to c6, and, you know, that'd just be me making a positional concession. But when the pawn is on c5, he can no longer do that, and he has to kind of worry a lot more about how does he actually defend the d5 pawn, not to mention that, you know, I can get my knight into a nice outpost on e5 and can sort of be active. So like, for example, it would be a big mistake for black in this position to play c4, because knight can take, queen takes f6, knight e5, and not only am I attacking the d5 pawn, but also, if you just try and protect it, now I'm going to play knight takes c4, because now after d takes c4, I get this very typical tactical motif working for me, and now black is just down a pawn. So there is definitely some concrete element that also goes into this whole thought process, right? But on the note of concrete stuff, right, like I also of course have to watch out for like what happens if something like knight g4 attacking my bishop, and they're just going to try and like trap it with moves like f6 and g5. And basically what I came up with was, I was like, okay, I'm going to play d takes c5 to start off with, because now if they go f6, I don't want to go bishop d4, because then they play b takes c5, right, putting this on the board, and my bishop is pretty much trapped and I look like an idiot. But what I came up with was I could play the intermediate move c6, bishop takes c6, bishop d4, and now I'm just playing against the IQP. If he ever takes me, like, that looks pretty bad. Like, I'm attacking the knight, I'm attacking the bishop. So I was pretty comfortable with the idea of going into this sort of position. And like, you know, if he takes back immediately, then I thought I could just play h3 actually. And if the knight comes back to f6, I calculated this variation. I'm like, I'm winning a pawn, I think. And if he plays like queen takes b2, for example, I can even get rook b1. And now I'm actually winning the bishop. So he can't really do that, I thought. And if after h3 he goes back to h6, well, I mean, the knight looks a little bit weird here. I can at least go g4, and now I can like hide my bishop on this square. And the position's sort of weird. Black has these active sort of hanging pawns in the center, but at the same time, their knight on h6 is pretty poorly placed. So I don't know, I wasn't sure what's better, but you know, it's an interesting position. And finally, last but not least, if he takes on e5, then I can just play knight takes e5, and I thought I have a lot of pressure in the center. My knight is also somewhat active in the center, but I have to be careful that it doesn't just get kicked out and that my activity is actually just temporary. But essentially what ended up happening after bishop e5 was knight g4 did happen after some thinking by Igor. I took, and we had this exact variation with h3, knight e5, knight e5. And here, for example, one thing I was thinking of was like, okay, if black tries to play something like knight c7, protecting the d5 pawn, maybe a very typical motif for white in this position would be to play something like knight c4, I thought, somewhat reminiscent of the tactical idea we had earlier. Like in this position, if black plays c4, we take and go knight e5, knight c4. This is just a very typical tactical motif that pops up in the Catalan a lot. I'm going to play knight a5, try and harass the bishop, and if the bishop dies, and so is the d5 pawn, so I was thinking maybe in the game, like, you go like a5, but then knight b6, right? And that does spell some trouble for black. But after like rook b8, you know, it's not so easy for white to actually improve from here. So maybe from that point of view, it might just be more sensible to go for something like knight d3, knight f4, and the knight doesn't maybe risk getting stranded on the side of the board. But nonetheless, what ends up happening was in this position, queen c7, which I didn't actually really see from afar, to be honest. And it did force me to make a bit of a decision, because if I just move backwards, I wasn't like ultra convinced. I was like, I feel just kind of passive now. Black has a bishop here. They have these active hanging pawns. One is ready to leap forward with d4 next. I thought I had to be very, very careful about a possibility like this occurring, which is why in the game I was like, I'm not retreating, I'm just going to play f4. But I really had to calculate this to make sure that I wasn't just doing something stupid, because like, okay, f6 is a very obvious move, but I was looking at ideas such as bishop takes d5, takes, queen takes d5, f takes e5, and it looks like I'm losing a piece, but I thought I could play f5 here and win it back actually at the end of the variation. I wasn't sure again if I was better, but I was like, okay, positionally I do have sort of a knight which can maybe hop into the e4 square for now. This bishop isn't the best piece in the world, material is equal. I thought it should be a fighting position at the very least, but okay, there was f6 is a mistake actually, but there was a lot cleaner of a way to punish this. Knight takes d5, takes f takes e5, queen g4, and basically there's just a lot of threats black has to deal with. There's this, and if they try to like defend this or something, again we still have like f5 in the cards. Probably queen d7 maybe is a little bit more accurate, since now if f5, queen takes d5, but this has its own issues because now we play this, and again this is still a threat, and now the queen is sort of in the eye of the bishop, sorry, the rook rather. So yeah, this is kind of really bad for black, which is why in the game what ended up happening was d4 instead. And after some thinking, I just went for the natural 95. I couldn't see what was too wrong with this. Queen d8, e4, and to be honest, I had no idea what was really going on here. Black has a passed d pawn, of course, but it's not super clear how they can really make use of it quite now. I have these super active looking knights. I also sort of have like these active looking central pawns, but they can't quite move because they're busy supporting my knights. And of course, black also has the bishop here, but in this position again, it's not quite clear how those actually play a role. So yeah, like a position which has a lot of potential for both sides, but is also really unclear as to how both sides are supposed to play it. This isn't something like you see in a book on pawn structures, and it's like, okay, you play moves X, Y, and Z, and you plug in this formula and you get the right move. It's like, I don't know, like you just sort of do stuff and try and make the best of it, I guess. But anyways, what Igor ended up doing after some thinking was a5, and yeah, during the game I was not too sure to make of this move. I didn't really understand it, to be honest. Still not sure I completely do. I guess the idea would just be to maybe gain some space on the queen side. I'm not sure if you want to really lift a rook here. Neither of those things ended up happening though, so tough to quite say what the intention was behind this move. But nonetheless, what I ended up doing was queen g4, where I basically just transfer my queen over to the king side, where at the moment there's no clear threat really, but I'm just sort of gradually transferring some of my pieces over to the king side, sort of being like, Igor, watch out, buddy, I might do something to harm your king. But this is where Igor also decided to throw some flair into the position, and by this point I should also note we were both down below 10 minutes, so sort of approaching time trouble. He played d3, and you know, obviously the most natural move is to play knight takes d3. I didn't end up playing this though because, again, sort of like earlier when I played like, say, f4 for example in this position, I didn't retreat with something like knight f3 or knight d3. I wanted to keep my pieces sort of as active as possible, and so I ended up playing rook e d1, not retreating. I'm sort of trying to round up the pawn with my rook instead. Not that I could see anything like concretely wrong with this per se, it was more like an intuitive decision, let's say, that I felt like this should probably be a little bit better than knight takes d3. Whether that's completely true or not, I'm not too sure, but okay, this is what happened. We had takes, knight d4, and this is where I probably should have just taken the pawn. You know, it's like what my last move sort of prepared, but I decided to get a little bit fancy here and bring another piece into the game with bishop e4. And what Igor ended up doing was knight e2 check, and he took, and then we had the following moves, and we agreed to a draw, because there's just no way that, you know, black can avoid a threefold repetition. But in fact, this move bishop e4, while, you know, it did go into this repetition, which, you know, from both our perspectives was an okay result, Igor thought he was just sort of worse, and I, you know, wasn't sure to make of the position and didn't really think I was better. But definitely after bishop e4, I sort of realized that he could probably just play g6. When after bishop takes d3, f5, I saw that I would have to play something like probably a queen h4, right? And if black plays queen takes h4 and exchanges queens, it's not completely clear that this is bad for me. But if he does go bishop e7, it looks like I'm borderline getting my queen trapped, but not really quite. And if I'm given enough time, I might be able to play something like knight takes g6 and sort of, you know, maybe go perpetual in, and that wouldn't be too different to maybe the result of the game. Not to mention black can just go for this threefold if they so desire. But there's some nice defensive details here that black can use, such as bishop f6 when after takes, instead of just, you know, taking and, you know, going bishop g7, when I'm not really completely sure that, you know, white's doing too badly after something like bishop takes f5 or maybe even bishop c4 and going d6, that looks kind of hard to stop. Black can go instead bishop g7, an intermediate move, and after queen h5 now takes, and you have an extra attempt here to do whatever you want, rook f8 and maybe going something like rook f6. It looks like a pretty good way to do things. And also, even after bishop e4, knight e2 check, king h2, I was also thinking g6 here, but he played knight takes e1 pretty quickly. But yeah, g6, and I was like, well, if I take, like, well, okay, no, if I take knight takes e1, now he wins the exchange, and this time I don't have like a threefold to claim, right? Which would then probably force me to play an awkward move like rook c4, I thought. And okay, of course, like f5 is not an issue because like I just take it, right? But I did feel like somehow, somewhere, that this should be pretty awkward to deal with. And I think on both of these occasions the computer agreed with me. And I was definitely a bit lucky and also careless with this move bishop e4. For some reason, I think it was only like after I really played it, I realized the sort of danger, which really stems from the fact that my queen just lacks squares, which it wouldn't have an issue with if I just played this, because now, of course, if you try and kick my queen around, I'm just going to go back to d1, and I'm up a pawn, but black sort of has some weird compensation with the fact they have this knight on d4. There's also opposite colored bishops if that plays a role, the open b file maybe. It's not super easy for white to push their past d pawn. All in all, like, just really weird position, right? But okay, if like I had to bet my money on someone, it would probably be white, not just because I was playing white, but because you have the extra pawn, and it's a weird position to play for both sides. But okay, yeah, the game ended in a draw, of course. We had the following threefold repetition, which I already showed before. And yeah, I mean, I was reasonably happy with the game, I guess. I sort of played this interesting idea with bishop e5, which I think the engine actually sort of liked, if I recall. And I mean, I was well out of prep by this point. I was just sort of trying to make things up on my own. And I was really unsure during the game whether this was just like complete bullshit what I was doing, or whether it was actually, you know, objectively had some sort of foundation that was building off of. Unfortunately, it did appear to be the latter. But anyways, that rounded out the second day for the Ryde Eastwood Open. there was 3 days this weekend. We're going to pick up from the 3rd day in our next recap, where I'm going to be looking at my round 6 game. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like on the video and also subscribe to the channel if you're not already. But anyways, I hope you guys have a good night. I will see you until next time.